All right, welcome everyone to the first briefing of the entire 2019 AAAS annual meeting. We are delighted to have you here. We're delighted to have our speakers here, and we're delighted to be promoting research from the open access journal Science Advances. So the research paper that we will be talking about today is called High Tide Flooding Disrupts Local Economic Activity. And the speakers, three authors on this briefing, are Dr. Chris Field, the Perry L. McCarty Director of the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment, Samantha Tiver Belanger, graduate student at the Stanford University Graduate School of Business and the School for Earth Energy and Environmental Sciences, Miyuki Hino, a PhD candidate in Environment and Resources at Stanford University. A reminder that this paper is embargoed until 2 p.m. today, or 2 p.m. tomorrow, so 2 p.m. tomorrow, Friday. That's when the embargo lifts. So we would ask that you not tweet about it during the briefing today. We will start the briefing momentarily. We will end at 9:45. If we have more questions than we can answer by that point, there is a follow-up room on this level, and we can walk you there with the speakers. Without further ado, we'll get started. Our first speaker, Dr. Field.
Thank you, and happy Valentine's Day to everyone. It's a pleasure to share some of the results of this paper that will be published in Advances on tomorrow. And it really unfolds a new chapter in our understanding of climate change impacts. We've made a transition recently to where our understanding of climate change has transitioned from a focus on projected future events to the recognition that climate change is something that's happening now, that we're already seeing impacts that are widespread and consequential. I guess the rising music is intended to convey the intrigue of the material I'll present. I'll try and speak over it. But climate change really is having impacts that we're seeing now, and we have a clear recognition that most of the impacts of climate change are packaged in extreme events, often catastrophic extremes like Hurricane Harvey in Houston in 2017, or the horrifying Camp Fire that destroyed the town of Paradise in California just a couple of months ago. But we're also seeing increasing evidence that climate change impacts can be packaged in what you might call micro extremes, and that was the focus of this study. Many areas, coastal areas in the US, were built as close to sea level as possible to facilitate the interaction between humans and the ocean. But as the sea has risen, that closeness to the ocean has transitioned from being an asset to being potentially a liability. There was a recent study that looked at 27 coastal communities in the US and found that back in the 1950s, those communities were influenced by high tide flooding in the order of 2 days per year. By the first decade of this century, that had increased to something over 11 days per year. Another recent study concluded that there are almost 200 communities in the US that will experience high tide flooding more than 25 days a year by 2035. Given this evidence that high tide flooding, sometimes it's called nuisance flooding, is getting to be more and more common, we were curious about whether this kind of micro extreme has real economic impacts. So we ended up focusing on the community of Annapolis, Maryland, which is very close to sea level, a historic waterfront, and based on the tide gauge, has sea levels that rise above the defined nuisance flood level many times per year. In 2017, it was 63 occurrences per year. And the question that we wanted to address in this study is whether high tide flooding is really just a nuisance or whether it's having real impacts on real people and real economies.
As an MBA candidate, I wanted to bring this lens to our work, and so we were particularly interested in how businesses were being impacted or affected by high tide flooding. And Annapolis became a great choice for this study. For its historic, mostly tourist-friendly downtown is known to flood regularly. The high local rate of sea level rise means those floods have quickly become more present, and the local government were collaborative and motivated to work with us throughout this process. And so if you've never been to Annapolis, let me describe a bit of the scene. So it has this historic downtown on a hill overlooking the Chesapeake Bay and its tributaries. At the bottom of that hill is City Dock, home to about 15 mostly tourist-oriented businesses, and at the center of those businesses lies a parking lot. It's right next to the water, and it's where many of the downtown visitors park. And while Annapolis experiences high tide flooding in other locations, it was here where the water spills onto the parking lots and sidewalks directly adjacent to the businesses that we saw this intersection of increased flooding and its impacts, and decided to focus our research. And when we began this work, we started with conducting interviews to understand what was going on day to day with flooding, with both business owners and operators and with government officials. We found from government officials were intimately aware of the flooding dynamics and concerned for its impact, present impact on the community. They were and are actively seeking grants to mitigate the issue, and were, again, excellent partners throughout this process. With the business owners and operators, we found that when we asked how often flooding occurs, we heard a very wide range, from 15 days a year to over 100 days a year. And when we asked what their operations looked like with flooding, we heard from a retailer, you know, usually UPS and those kinds of people can get here by just going through the water and going to the side here. So it doesn't affect that part of our business. To a food service provider who said, if I know there is a tide coming, then I'll alert my main supplier. These individuals clearly had experience handling flooding and were quickly learning how to adjust their businesses. And so we asked about the impact of these floods, and again heard that wide, varied responses. From, quote, 50-50 on if foot traffic is higher or lower on flood days, end quote. This respondent believed that flooding sometimes attracted tourists to the downtown, that they came to look at the water and stayed for the shopping. To the other extreme, where, quote, if it's flood down here at all, even if it's just half the parking lot, they'll just go up there and forget about us and not bother, end quote. Meaning shoppers patronize the stores along Main Street, up the hill and away from the water. From these interviews, we knew that the way of business was changing, but it wasn't clear in the direction or magnitude of that impact. And so we knew we needed to quantify and more precisely understand the frequency of flooding to understand what it means for the community of Annapolis.
Great, thanks, Samantha. So I'll now get into what we actually did in this research and what we found. So high tide flooding is tricky to study because the floods are very brief. They often come in with the tide and they go out with the tide. So in practice, this posed two main challenges. The first, there's no record of these events, so we had to actually develop a record of when it was flooding and where. And the second was that we had to measure impacts on this really short time scale. These weren't long-lasting infrastructure impacts. These were impacts that were materializing when there was water, but then disappearing with the water. So to deal with the first issue of developing a record of flooding, we gathered as much visual evidence as we could of flooding at City Dock. So this included pictures from social media, from local government officials, and video footage from a police camera that actually overlooks the dock. We matched all of those photos to a water level on the tide gauge based on the timestamp of them. And by doing that, we could establish an observation-based flood threshold. So that's the minimum water level on the tide gauge needed to cause flooding at City Dock. For the next challenge of measuring the impacts, this is why City Dock was a really well-suited place for us to do this study. City Dock is a parking lot that charges for parking and records every transaction down to the minute. So we could use this record of parking transactions to see hour by hour how visits were fluctuating with the flooding. We really wanted to drill down and isolate the relationship between flooding and visits. So in our statistical analysis, we controlled for a bunch of things that might also be affecting visits. We controlled for rainfall, the month of the year, the day of the week, and the time of day. So what we were really doing is we were comparing visits on a Tuesday at noon in October that was flooded to visits on a Tuesday at noon in October that wasn't flooded. So this was as much of an apples to apples comparison as possible. When we did that, we found that high tide flooding reduced visits to City Dock by about 2%, or 3,000 visits in 2017. We didn't find any evidence that people were coming later in the day or that they were parking nearby and walking over. So to us, this means that high tide flooding is already measurably disrupting the economic activity in this location. Those 3,000 visits translate to about $100,000 in lost revenue across about 16 businesses at City Dock. Looking forward, these impacts grow very, very quickly. So with just 3 more inches of additional sea level rise, lost visits would double. And with an additional foot of sea level rise, City Dock would see about 24% fewer visitors than it would in a year with no floods. Those projected numbers all assume no adaptation. So what those numbers about the future really tell us is that there's a huge need for and huge potential benefit from adaptation in this location. And as Samantha mentioned, the city's already actively working on solutions in this space. And there are a really wide range of possible interventions, not only in Annapolis, but in all of the other locations that are experiencing this type of flooding that can help to reduce these impacts into the future. And I think we'll stop there.
Great. Thank you to our speakers. So we will now open the floor to questions. We have a handheld mic that we can bring to you. If you could raise your hand if you have a question, and please state your name and affiliation before you ask one too. Okay. All right, our first question here.
Hi, thank you. Is it working? Yes. Okay, great. Hi, I'm Janessa Duncombe. I'm from EOS at the American Geophysical Union. Yeah, I was curious, to what extent can this study of this, one coastal town tell us about all of the other coastal towns that may be affected by nuisance flooding?
We see Annapolis as a really nice case study where we can unfold the impacts of this kind of event. We know from other sources of information that this sunny day or high tide flooding is really common in coastal areas, and we're not yet at the point where we can directly extrapolate from Annapolis to the economic costs around the country and around the world. But I think the way to understand this study is that it opens the doorway to understanding how pervasive and consequential this kind of event can be. And one of the things we're struggling with now is how to get sufficient information from other places so that we can really do a large-scale quantification, starting from the confidence that this is something that's happening everywhere.
Question here.
Robin Williams from Australia. If you'll excuse the rather partial preamble. When I left Australia last week, northern Queensland, Townsville was completely underwater with the biggest floods they've ever seen. And the river system was so full of dead fish, the main river system, that you could not see the end of it on the horizon, packed with dead fish. In Tasmania, which is way down south, there were 85 fires, and there had been a similar number in winter. And I don't even mention the fact that the Barrier Reef is there, dying, 50% of it is gone. And my wife sent me an email yesterday saying in Sydney, at midnight, it was 31 degrees C. Are we beginning to see a pattern? I know it's beyond your immediate study, but are we beginning to see a pattern of extreme events mounting to something which is clear evidence of effective climate change?
It's a really good question. In the last few years, we have transitioned to having a much more mature ability to attribute particular extremes to consequences of climate change that's already happened, and for essentially all of the heat waves, we can see the fingerprints of climate change. So far, for about half of the flood events that have been analyzed, we can see a clear fingerprint of climate change. And certainly the personal experience of most people is that we seem to be transitioning from an extreme here and an extreme there to this pattern and repeated extremes at a frequency that's really unheard of. Now that last statement isn't really confirmed by the analysis to date. And part of the reason that we wanted to do this study is to kind of fill in the gaps in our understanding of the consequences of climate change so that people understand that it's a kind of a tapestry of the really catastrophic extremes, all the way to what you might perceive as just a little annoyance, but those little annoyances really add up to something that makes a difference.
Question in the back.
Hi, this is Vijay Shankar. I'm a freelance journalist and a Eureka Alert Fellow this year. Thank you for your briefing. And my question is, like, how are you planning, or are you planning to scale this study up to different regions within the US or any other parts of the world, especially island nations, because they are at the very immediate risk of sea level rise and the local social and economic activity?
We are trying to scale this up now, as Chris mentioned, and it's tricky because, as I mentioned, we don't really know what's flooding when, and we have to be able to measure something on these tiny timescales, and those types of data are hard to come by because we typically measure things at a monthly or annual scale. What we're trying to do is take advantage of some of the really recent advances in data availability, for instance, from satellite imagery that's now more regular and at higher resolution than it ever has been before, and also some more unusual sets of location information, like from mobile phones. So what we're working on now is putting together those data sets and seeing if we can, now that we know what the effects are in a single place, to what extent we can replicate this core method using different data in other places.
Miyuki, are there things that local communities that are, poised to experience this flooding should be doing? Should they be setting up new data networks? And if so, what kinds of data networks so that they could help you capture the data that you need? Hashtag parking flooding or something? I don't know. Oh. Yeah, would you mind if I was just curious? And then, yes, we'll come right to you. Okay.
Sure. So there are a lot of interesting new efforts to document this kind of flooding. Citizen science here, there's a real opportunity to engage people who are seeing this outside of their houses once a week. And so there are some efforts in Norfolk, Virginia. There's an effort called Catch the King, or something about the King Tide, I think, where they enlisted a lot of volunteers to go out and take pictures and geolocate those photos of where the water was. And so I think there are huge opportunities to do things like that, and that would help researchers like me a lot in figuring out what's underwater and when.
Thank you. Okay, question here now.
Hello, I'm Jyoti Singh and I'm from India Science Wire. I'm also a Eureka Alert Fellow this year. So my question is, like AAA the theme is transacting boundaries. Like science is not about some country, 1, 2, or 3. It should include the whole world. I'll be more specific. I'll quote the example of Indian subcontinent where there are, we are like observing continuous high-rise floods, glacier melts, all those climate changes, we are also experiencing all those things. Like in northeast of India, there is continuous reports that the glaciers are melting, and they are melting with like very high speed. We can't even imagine, like there are reports. So I'm asking, like, do you have some satellite setup or something like those setups where you are measuring those countries also? Are you focusing on some Asian region also? Like it is all about the globe, I think. So do you have some setup where you're observing this kind of things?
We very much hope that this study can be indicator of an important direction for the global research community to go. in focusing on one community and one state in the United States, we weren't trying to say that this problem is isolated, but that what we wanted to do was really open a doorway so that researchers around the world, including us, can more accurately characterize where the problems are occurring, how bad they are, and begin to suggest solutions for people to deal with them. And as Miyuki has already explained, a lot of the critical data on this kind of experience can be provided from citizen science and not necessarily from fancy satellites or tide gauges, and things like hashtags about "we're flooded now" really make it possible for us and others to do the kind of analysis that'll let us start to put together a global picture of what's happening.
Question here?
Could you actually...
Sorry.
My name's Ivan Kron. I work for the French news agency, Agence France Presse.
Thank you.
Could you actually expand on the fancy satellites? You know, what's if we wanted to use satellite imagery today? Is it possible? What's the level of details we have today? And in terms of you know, the time scale, what's the status today, and what's coming online in the next few years?
I can give a narrow answer to that question in the context of high tide flooding. Because these floods don't last for very long, the challenge is actually getting an image when it is flooded. So in Annapolis, we checked. There is an image. There's a satellite image when City Dock is flooded, and you can actually see it from the naked eye, the extent of the water. There are also reflectance. You can use reflectance measurements to detect the presence of water through those images. Now, I think almost the entire globe is being imaged at about, at a very small spatial resolution every day. So we're getting a picture every day, and the question is, how many pictures in a location do we need to get one or a couple where it's flooded? And that's a question that we're still working on now. But I think I should flip it over to Chris for a kind of bigger picture of the question of what data satellites can provide to us, especially in this rapidly changing time.
I agree with Miyuki that a really exciting development in the satellite imaging world is the availability of these small sats, the microsats, where, you know, in the past we had 2 or 3 Earth imaging satellites, and now there are more than 100 that are providing images of the Earth every day. And once we're to the stage of having something like hourly images, that we can really begin to see where things are flooding. And another exciting development with the satellite imagery is we are beginning to be able to develop a much better sense of local topography as a consequence of using satellite images in stereographic mode, the way that historically people used airplane photographs in order to build elevation maps. So I think that within the next few years, we'll have sufficient information that we can really think about analyzing based on visual observations and good elevation data where these events are occurring, and then hopefully we'll be able to acquire the other kinds of information that lets us assess how much impact that's having.
Okay, we have a question in the front row. We're going to make our mic runner run. Thank you.
I'm Philippa Benson from AAAS. I'm wanting to sort of go back to the economic side of this. So you got you looked at how this was having an impact on the businesses sort of short term during these flooding events. I'm wondering if you or others know about longer term deleterious effects of the flooding. So I'm thinking when the flooding goes up and the understructure of the parking lot over time starts to fall apart, or the wood holding up the businesses starts to rot, and the businesses have to be aware of that, plan for it, all those kinds of sort of longer, not super long term, but longer term impacts of the flooding events. Are you or others trying to collect data on that, timescales, and the economics.
So we did try to look in a little bit more deeply here, and there is not a ton of work being done in this space. I will say that of the business owners and operators that we were talking to, they are wildly adaptive and resilient people who were thinking about day to day, how do we keep this being a profitable and successful business, and are continuing to evaluate how they change the way they do their work on a day-to-day basis when a flood shows up for 2 hours. But they're also paying attention to when that water comes in and how more frequently they're having to replace their tables and chairs because they're getting damaged. So I think a lot of that sort of knowledge base is going to be there with those people and that lived experience.
Casey Hayes, also AAAS. Sort of on that note, with these shop owners, you said you had like a lot of different they said different things going into the study about how much it affected them. You know, some saying it brought in business. After the study, did you share your results with the shop owners, and how did they react to like hearing I might be losing thousands of dollars a year to high tide flooding?
Unfortunately, well, we've been in close contact with the local government throughout this whole process, and we've gone back to them, and they know what we have found. There's not that much we can do before the paper comes out. Right. So we could not yet go back to these business owners and say, here, look at our findings. But you can't tell anyone, until Friday at 2 p.m. or anything like that. But now, once it comes out, we would love to continue the community conversation. I know that how that area city dock is going to evolve, is a big question right now in Annapolis, and there's a lot of opinions about how to deal with the high tide floods, how to deal with the storms, all sorts of things, and we would love to continue to help them talk through what they're looking at in the future.
If there are a range of, adaptation options, are some of them as extreme as picking up the businesses and moving them entirely, whereas others are smaller, related to walls or something? Is there quite a range of adaptive possibilities?
Yeah, absolutely. So the main option that the city has been talking about is putting in new drainage pumps that would pump the water out of the parking lot and back into the bay. But depending on where you look, there's a lot of different approaches that are being taken. So you could elevate structures. In Annapolis, these are really historic buildings, so they don't really want to do that. Mm-hmm. You could think about putting in a temporary alternative entrance, right, to those businesses while the parking lot's underwater. In some cases, businesses might be able to shift a lot more of their sales to being online, right, at different times. There are different communications campaigns to make sure people know when it's flooded and can get to the business when it's not flooded. I think there are a ton of options from totally non-structural to more of a public works type of intervention. And it's really going to depend on the local context what the right answer is.
Great. Okay. Well, if we don't have any other questions, thank you so much to all of our speakers. And a reminder to reporters, this paper is embargoed until tomorrow at 2 p.m. when the community of Annapolis can learn the good findings. But this was great. So thank you so much. A round of applause for our speakers. Yeah.